Let's talk about archies and crassies, kind of like arts and crafts, but archies and crassies. Uh, archies come from the Greek archon, or leader, and here I'm talking about things like hierarchy and anarchy. Those are the two we're going to focus on most specifically. And then the crassy side of it, crassy means using the power of. So hierarchy means the leader is decided initially by ranks of angels, was the way it was used, but it means sacred order, hierarchy. And then anarchy, of course, means no leader, without a leader, right? And then crassy, which is using the power of. And so we're going to focus on a couple of crassies to start with: bureaucracy, the power of the bureau, and technocracy, the power of the technology or the techne. So basically what we're talking about here are questions of leadership and of control, and we're also going to end up talking about the internet quite a bit as part of that process. Let's begin with the bureaucratic institution or the bureaucratic organization. Bureaucracy isn't a bad word. I know that it tends to be used that way, especially today. We talk about how bureaucratic a particular system might be, about how you have to deal with all the red tape. Bureaucracy is marked by kind of inefficiency and errors and a lack of humanity, but it misses kind of the real reason that we adopted bureaucracy in the first place. Bureaucracy is this process of using the bureau, that is, of codifying processes and information. And the bureau in this case meaning like a file drawer, right? A collection of files. So instead of putting all of the power in individuals, for example, it puts the power in the records. It puts the power in the processes by which people arrive at ideas. And so the bureaucracy is an essential process in rationalizing an organization, in making the decisions not about how someone is feeling today, but about how a set of rules and data inform those rules in order to come up with a solution. It tends not to be highly adaptive because those rules are codified and they may or may not be easily changed, but it does allow for a very large organization to still operate. If you have a leadership through not records, but through people, it can be very difficult to operate a large organization. The power then is in the people. But especially with a combination of hierarchy, that is, people answering to one another in turn in layers of control, and bureaucracy, power distributed through records and expectations and codes, you can create organizations that are effective and still very, very large. This is essential, obviously, to mass society, but the places where we see bureaucracy and hierarchy kind of at their pinnacle are things like in the military, for example. You can have a very large military that must operate quickly and effectively, and to do that, you need to have both sets of standard operating procedures that are codified, that are understood by everyone involved, as well as a structure of leadership, so you know to whom you answer and who is responsible for various areas. But that pattern is also pretty much what we expect throughout all of mass society. So we see that not just in the military, but in businesses especially, this process of creating things in a business, and in other organizations, in churches, and we'll talk about it in a minute, in places like universities, and in nonprofits, and in all kinds of different organizations in mass society. A combination of bureaucracy and of to a certain degree, hierarchical organization, allows for mass production and the creation of mass culture and a whole range of sort of massification processes. In fact, I mean, if you want to think of the industrial age as a machine, this makes society into some kind of a well-oiled machine. And that connection to machinery is important because it brings in another one of our Crassy's technocracy, leading right up to the Great Depression. So in the 1920s, Thorstein Veblen, among others, Veblen, if you've run into him, you're probably more familiar with his coining of the theory of the leisure class, this idea that that people can engage in conspicuous consumption. That was one of his key phrases as well. That the way the economy worked was for people to kind of try to accelerate to that, and he was a critic of things like rents. That is, people who survived merely by owning something and renting it to others. So he was an economist who thought that the economy would be better run by economists. Naturally, people like him, right? But he also thought in general that a lot of the functions of government could be better run by people who were experts in those areas. And this idea of engineers in leadership positions is generally referred to as technocracy. That is, leadership, the leaders are the technologies, or not so much technologies as techne. Techne, the word technology is knowledge about techne. And techne is, the root of technology is this idea of the ability to know how to do something, right? So it wasn't necessarily, technocracy doesn't really talk about technology being the leader so much as people who have the ability to know how to do something, which is kind of the definition of engineers and other kinds of experts being in charge and leading. So the power comes from those who know what they're doing. That when I put it that way, the power should be in the hands of people who know what they're doing, it actually sounds pretty good. But technocracy kind of hit its peak when people were very excited about technology. So Veblen was early in the 1920s, but especially during the 40s and 50s when people were starting to talk about sort of cybernetics and that kind of thing. The idea of using technology in large computing devices, for example, in order to make better government work, both in government itself and in businesses and that sort of thing. This idea of a technocratic approach to leadership and to organizing institutions really hit its ascendancy then. Now, mind you, it still does exist. Even today, even though we don't talk about technocracy, if you look at the federal government, for example, traditionally there are organs of the federal government that are very technocratic. Law is a good example. The entire judicial branch is, although theoretically we could have Supreme Court justices who knew nothing about the law, who had never been trained in law, generally speaking, jurisprudence is now the area of people who have law degrees, who are experts in the law in some way. And there are other organs of government. If you look at the various, within the federal government, if you look at the various departments, for example, the clearest example of this is something like the Surgeon General, right? The Surgeon General position needs to be filled by someone who understands public health, who is a doctor, who has training in medicine, and is capable of doing that. By law, the director of the Department of Energy is supposed to be a scientist as well, someone who has training in physics and can understand the issues that the Department of Energy has to deal with in terms of especially maintaining our nuclear arsenal and also dealing with kind of regulating the nuclear industry in particular, but other areas as well. So these are traditionally fairly technocratic positions. And if you look through each of the secretaries, they often are fairly technocratic positions. They're part of the bureaucracy. The executive branch is a bureaucratic branch. It executes the laws, and therefore it has to be bureaucratic to work. But it's also very technocratic, that the people who are in those positions should at least have the experience and expertise to execute these things. It isn't, if you look back in history, you saw, for example, why did Shirley Temple become an ambassador? You had people that were either, in some cases, heavy donators to political campaigns, to election campaigns, or celebrities who were then installed in various positions. But that dwindled, mostly through the last half century or so. And there's this expectation that if you're going to be in charge of something, you should have a deep set of knowledge around that. So not just those. Department of State, traditionally, it is very technocratic in that like other organs of government, it's to get a job at state, you take the State Department exam, you take the Foreign Service exam, and demonstrate that you have this capability. It's very much about knowledge and ability rather than other kinds of fuzzier issues of personality. Joint Chiefs of Staff. The reason the Joint Chiefs of Staff is filled with people who have military experience is the expectation is, especially after Vietnam, that people who had the kind of technical expertise to wage war should be in charge of executing wars. Certainly the civilian population, us, the voters, should be in charge of talking about whether we want to go to war or whether we must go to war. But the actual execution of the kind of those military objectives should be put in the hands of people who were experts. So even though we don't talk about technocracy in the same way, and even though it's kind of become a bad word, it has seeped. Oh, and the most obvious example of this is the Fed. And this is the one that Veblen was originally interested in. In other words, our economy is largely managed by economists, at least to the degree to which it is managed at all. And this has been an important part of the success of American government, is this strong technocratic government. Now, of course, the move to both technocracy and bureaucracy, or bureaucracy and then technocracy, is not without its critics. And we could go through a whole list of kinds of critics, but certainly this idea of workers being a cog in the wheel, this idea of Fordism, or this move to the assembly line, and time and motion studies, where you really wanted to see how people were moving in a space and making them as absolutely efficient in doing things like assembling machines. Those processes were very much part and parcel of bureaucracy. This idea of we can make production entirely rational, and so there's definitely been kickbacks against that, pushbacks against that, because it turns people into machines. It turns people into cogs in machines. So obviously, this is probably one of the most famous sets of imagery from early film, which is Charlie Chaplin in modern times. There's other films in which he does similar things, but this is kind of the iconic view of what it means to be on the assembly line, right? You give up your humanity. The machine is telling you what to do. It's controlling your movements. And then as you went into the 1950s, you had books like The Lonely Crowd, and one called White Collar, which was written by sort of one of my academic heroes. And these started to critique what it meant to be kind of part of the rat race, right? You had, especially, this was a booming period in the 1950s, the growth of what kind of the white collar worker, but what were we giving up part of our humanity to be part of that rat race, to kind of engage in these kinds of institutions and be part of an institution and consider your position in society in relationship to these bureaucratic structures? And was that making us give something up? By the 1960s, we had the counterculture rising up, and a lot of the pieces of that counterculture really pushed hard against both technocracy and bureaucracy. I guess you could put One-Dimensional Man, the book by Herbert Marcuse, in there. I don't know that many people read One-Dimensional Man anymore. You may have. This is a book that is a criticism of especially consumer culture. Marcuse is a Marxist. In fact, during the 1960s, people talked about the 3 M's, which were Marx, Mao, and Marcuse. And he was living in the United States, transplant as part of the Frankfurt School. And he argued that modern capitalism, late capitalism, created needs. They created false needs. And so people felt like they needed to get stuff, instead of the normal hierarchy of needs, we had these false needs that were made up as part of the consumer culture. And as a result, we have this very common refrain that we're losing our humanity. Into the 1970s, very much affected by that counterculture, are people like Fritz Schumacher, who wrote this book called Small is Beautiful. And this pushes very much against not just bureaucracy, but especially technocracy. He felt that the bureaucracy and the technological invasion of things like education, of medicine, the massification was at fault for a lot of what we were losing in terms of who we were as people, as humans. And so his famous book is called Small is Beautiful. Did I say that? Probably. But he wrote a number of books as well that looked for what he called appropriate technology. And this was the beginning of the appropriate technology movement, this idea that technology should be put to use where they are needed and only then. You shouldn't just assume that applying a technology to a problem will fix it, because in many cases it brings its own issues with it. And so he was very much against the idea of technocracy, this idea of leadership by the machine or leadership by the experts on the machine. He wanted to turn our machines more human instead of the humans turning into more machines. So I'm going to switch gears here for a second and ask you a definitional question and say, what is the internet?
What is the internet?
The internet is like a popular thing.
Some satellites up there.
I picture in my head with like waves of internet going to the phone.
Somebody told me a cloud once.
The internet is a lot like plumbing. It's always moving.
The internet is not something that you just dump something on. It's not a big truck. It's a series of tubes.
And I guess the obvious answer is something like it's a worldwide communication and information network, or a worldwide computer network. And that's kind of what it leads to, but I don't think that's quite the internet. You might use a definition that you would find in a sort of networking book, a book on computer networking, which would be something like it's a network of networks. This is technically correct. It networks a lot of local and wide area networks into a much broader network. And so it's right in as far as it goes, but it doesn't really tell us enough that we would know what to do about that. I mean, the next question is, how does it do that? And the answer to that question is that essentially the internet is a set of agreements. Internet protocol, IP, transmission control protocol. So normally those go together as a pair of protocols, which is abbreviated as TCP/IP. But internet protocol, a protocol is basically a set of agreements that people say, if you follow these agreements, you're part of the internet. So I can attach anything to the internet. It doesn't have to be an Apple. It doesn't have to be an IBM. It doesn't even have to be, there's a protocol that says how you can carry internet messages using carrier pigeon. It's actually an official protocol of the internet, part of the RFC process. So you can carry it via optical. That one's a silly use. It was kind of promulgated as a joke. It is an official protocol, or RFC at least, or request for comments, but it was kind of a joke. But there are less jokey things, like you can carry the internet over light beam, right? So as long as you follow the rules of the internet, as long as you kind of tacitly agree to these very core ideas of how IP works, of how the basic protocol works, you can play. It's very open. So on the one hand, it's extremely bureaucratic. In other words, by definition, bureaucratic means kind of turning the information processes to the external and recorded process, and the IP process, the protocols for the internet, and then the protocols that are kind of layered on top of the basic internet protocol. So, the internet is built of these layers. It's not built of tubes, it's built of layers. So, at the base level, it's just a very simple set of structures that say, if you play by these rules, then you can do stuff on the internet. And the next step up is kind of, if you play by these rules, you can send stuff over the web, for example. Or these are a set of rules you can use if you want to play with the email systems, or if you want to play with a range of other kinds of transmission protocols that you can use over the internet. Everything from telephony to video to streaming. Each of these has its own little package of protocols, all the way up through things like HTML, or a way of encoding pictures in JPEG or MPEG. So you can kind of layer this very, I guess if you published all these protocols together, it would be pretty overwhelming. They are public and published. That's what makes, you don't do secret protocols for the open internet. But they're also open. Anybody can play with these protocols. Nobody owns them. This is different than kind of what happens with closed sets Apple was the Apple Macintosh was kind of the key for this for the very long time, because if you wanted to know how to play with an Apple, you had to talk to Apple and get their permission to understand quite how to do it. And that's not as true anymore at all, but for a while it was, and the internet has always been very much against that. It's been a bureaucracy, yes, but it's been an open bureaucracy. Everyone knows what those basic rules are. The funny thing is that the way that they arrive at that core set of rules is very non-bureaucratic. So there are a number of organizations that have a hand in how the internet is formed and how it's managed. There's a lot of focus on how to manage something called the domain name system and how to assign IP addresses, Internet Protocol addresses, to various machines on the net, and that's kind of its own world. But in terms of the protocol itself, most of that is the responsibility of a group called the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. So the IETF, its motto, I don't think it's an official motto, but it's fairly widely known as its motto, is that what they are trying to do is create rough consensus and running code. Actually, if you wanted to understand a lot of what is happening in terms of the change in control and leadership in an internet era, knowing that key phrase, rough consensus and running code, tells you an awful lot. The running code part of it is, engineering is right in the name. If it works, that's a good thing. There's this idea that this is probably the technocratic part of it, that if we can make it work, that's really kind of an important piece of this. And the rough consensus part means that we're not going to have rules necessarily. When they come together, they don't have Robert's Rules of Order. They don't vote on changes usually. They just get together and they discuss it and they say, how do we think we can make this run better? So it is a very anarchic kind of process. There isn't a clear leader. There's no president of the internet. There's, at least on the protocol side, really not at all, right? There's no one voting for how it should work. Not all internet users get to say, I don't like the protocol the way it works now. I think we should change it. They don't have to do electioneering around it. It's a group of people who come together, usually in San Diego or somewhere else, and they talk about how the protocol is working and how they might need to shift it, if at all. And they run on this idea of rough consensus and running code. That idea leaks over to all kinds of other, not just standards making bodies, not just groups like the IETF, but has really leaked into a lot of what we do. So it bleeds over into things like meetings that are not around protocols at all. So Burning Man is a little bit like this, right? There's a set of core principles that you have to follow, and as long as you follow those principles, it's pretty much open to all. You have to pay for a ticket. But leaving that aside, it's open to all. Anyone can come as long as they follow these core set of rules, and then you can kind of organize things around that on the fly. And this is, an adhocracy. We can kind of create this as an ad hoc. As need arises, we can get together and reach consensus and do something. The reason we can do that is that the core machinery running under it is based on a set of rules, and those principles can be changed, but they change very slowly and only with a lot of renegotiation. So the core principles kind of drive, they're generative principles. They drive the ability to interact with one another. And not just Burning Man, but a bunch of things called unconferences. Things that one of the originals of these was called Foo Camp. And it's just a set of, you don't have an agenda. You all show up. You have a set of principles. You have a set of shared objectives. This might sound familiar as a community of practice, but you have a set of repertoires. You have a set of ways of that people have traditionally interacted, and so you have people who know about those and can introduce them. You see a lot of whiteboards. You see a lot that people can scribble on. I think that this particular change in organization probably has driven the sales of Post-it notes through the ceiling. People buy way more Post-it notes because they're essential to things like organizing an unconference or kind of a lot of these processes of reaching consensus. So, any kind of meeting now on the tech side, it's pretty common to see this process of adhocracy in practice. even in software design, the traditional model for software design is called the waterfall model, where you would come up with a set of user needs, and then you would design a set of specifications, and then you would split that up into the pieces that need to be created, and then you'd put this into a large group of programmers who would program it, and then you would test it, and if anything went wrong, you would kind of back up through that process. It was very much staged, very much bureaucratic, very much a hierarchical process. There were people who had particular job titles that were only specific to doing that piece of what they needed to do. This is how I guess one operating system, things like Microsoft Windows, were created through this very large-scale process of controlled, step-by-step specification and then execution. That is largely fallen aside, not completely, but most software projects now use some variation on what's called an agile process. And in this case, it's a matter of doing little pieces by little pieces, often people stepping in and taking over some part of it. There's a process called Scrum where you meet periodically, either every day or every week, and everyone talks about what they're working on, and they put their process to the exterior. Often there is a board where people can talk about which pieces they need to tackle next, and people will just step up and say, I think I can do that, I'll take that on. And so there's this kind of ad hoc process by which things get assembled. There's this push towards something called the MVP, a minimum viable product. So instead of kind of saying these are all the specifications we need and what's going to be made, I can think of some very large promised game releases that never happened because the specification was there, but they just couldn't get there. Gaming is not my area, but I believe there is almost a legend around a particular Duke Nukem game that took a decade and never got released under that decade. And then you contrast that with something like Minecraft, which was released as a minimum viable product. Something that kind of worked, but then you got other people to kind of test it and make suggestions. And Minecraft itself is also designed so that the users create a lot of the assets. They create a lot of what's there. You don't have designers going in and making beautiful cars to drive around the environment. You have users going in and building stuff and then adding mods to the original construction, and then you have the company itself, which eventually does become Microsoft, improving little by little how the system works as they're interacting with users. So it's very much an ad hoc process. The core is there, but the process by which you get to your end product is a consensus process. People kind of just jump in and they say, this would be nice to have. The most extreme example of that comes from the open source community. That is, those who produce software in an open way. And so I said Microsoft Windows is an operating system that was built using this waterfall model. The exact opposite of that is something like Linux, that was produced by, a core group of people who made the core piece of the operating system, the kernel, but then people from all over kind of using different pieces and attaching them to this core. And as long as you agreed to play by the rules, you could kind of build around it. And then people could say, oh, well, that kind of works with what I'm doing, so I accept your suggestion. So there is a leadership process, but it's largely a consensus leadership process. People agree that the person who did the most work on it is usually kind of in charge of whether something gets added to their piece of the project or not. But not just software development. So this agile process certainly has now a very large foothold in software production, but it also bleeds over into producing all kinds of other things. I mean, I think you could make an argument that the auto production in Japan that allowed for continuous improvement, that allowed for anyone on the line to hit a big red button and say stop, and stop the line and say we need to change or improve this thing right now. Things like just-in-time production, which was, all of these actually happened under, in many cases, consultants coming from the U.S. to Japan, ironically enough. And then once it worked very well in Japan, the whole process got re-imported into the United States. But a lot of these, going back into the 1970s especially, and then into the 1980s, a lot of these processes have some affinity with agile approaches. But even that agile approach itself, things like Kickstarter, where people make, again, a minimal viable physical product and then get investors who are actually consumers to buy into that and then test it and then improve it with a second generation or an eighth generation or continually updating. Or something like the Tesla, where, one of the nice things about software is you can, upgrade it and do an overnight change to that software, which is now much more common. You don't do releases so much as continually improving that piece of software. And as more and more of our hardware is software driven, and the Tesla is an example of that, a lot of it is kind of computer driven, that means that you can kind of do over-the-air updates for hardware products. So a lot of this process is leaking over, and that organization around consensus is also becoming much more common. That people generally don't have hierarchies in the same way they did. Middle management is dying. You have management, and then you have teams, and those teams can be more or less hierarchical or bureaucratic. At the extreme end, you have something like Zappos, which has been made this very hard push towards something called holarchy. This idea that everybody in the organization is capable of doing any job in the organization to a greater or lesser extent, and they can kind of move around, and they don't have official titles. This was a very trendy thing to talk about for a while, and recently there's been some stuff in Harvard Business Review and elsewhere that suggests it's not very successful when it's employed in many cases. But there is a lot of this experimenting around the edges with far less bureaucratic and hierarchical processes. And this is allowed by technologies that kind of are stable. So it's not that technocracy or bureaucracy has disappeared. It's just that it's been put in place for the pieces that need to remain stable, and that actually frees up a lot of the human processes to be more humane. What does this mean? Well, it means that, one of the problems with anarchism, and we're not talking about chaos here, we're talking about leaderless social organization, is that they tend to work for a while and then someone tries to take over because things aren't quite working right. So we won't read this semester, but there's an essay by Hakim Bey called Temporary Autonomous Zones. I may point you to it later on, but this idea of that autonomy, that lack of centralized control, tends to be temporary. It can happen, but it tends to dissolve over time. So you have to be continually trying to recreate that space for autonomy. And that can be done in somewhere like Burning Man by having a core set of technocratic and bureaucratic processes that can kind of be set aside. And often these can be now automated. That is, we can allow the technology to take over the pieces that we know are rational and structured and undergird a lot of the other pieces. So the possibility of having leaderless social organizations is opening up now because we have this very strong set of technological and bureaucratic processes that can continue and support these much more anarchic processes. There's a couple of poets at the end of the 18th century named Samuel Coleridge and Robert Southey, pushed this idea of pantisocracy, which is never going to catch on because you can't really say it quickly 5 times. But it was this idea of everyone being equal. And anarchy at the time of the Diggers especially was and today too, is something that people pushed against. It feels very dangerous. But the idea here was that for pantisocracy is that if you had people who were all willing to kind of come together and everyone be equal in their power within the they were trying to found what we would now call a commune, that they would all be able to kind of participate and do what they loved, and that the basics would be taken care of. Their plan was to work 3 hours a day, and then that would kind of cover their basics. And then these people who were like-minded could come together, and without having to keep up with the Joneses or any of the rest of it, they could kind of cover their basic needs and then kind of have a life of the mind beyond that. This idea, which has definitely roots that go much deeper into history and come all the way to today, is enabled by the technologies that provide for the dirty work. So, I mean, this has always been the problem with communism, right? Alienating work doesn't disappear. What do? You know, that's fine. It's fine. You know, communes are great until someone has to clean the toilet, right? You need to have work that people don't want to do done. And this was always a difficulty with socialism, with communism, with anarchism, that there were things that needed to get done, and it's not true that you will find someone who loves cleaning toilets. I just don't buy that. So, you know, there was always going to be alienating work. The trick is that if you can build the technology that does get rid of some of that alienating work. I mean, picking is the perfect example of this. Nobody loves to pick strawberries. I mean, yes, they love to do it on a lark if they're doing a small basket for themselves, but no one likes to spend 12 hours in the heat picking strawberries. It's just not something that people aspire to doing. But as more and more of this alienable work gets taken up by machines, robotics, and automation, it opens up the possibilities of not just people working less or people working in jobs they like more, but of undoing some of the structures of bureaucracy and technocracy that have made us less human as a society. The idea of cybernetics comes from the Greek cyber, which is to steer. And so the technocratic vision of this, and this was especially during the 50s and 60s, was that you could get computers that steered government. In other words, you could get rid of the people like presidents and kings and replace them with computers. But that's not steering, that's being the captain. Steering is like an autopilot, right? So if we can create autopilots for the things that can be automated, that opens up the possibility for humans to do what humans do best, to engage passionately in organizations, to live as people and not as cogs in the machine.